lessons I learned ghostwriting romance as a non-romance writer. LitReactor is a great resource for articles on writing craft, business, interest for readers, and things of that nature. I think it's one of the better sites on, and I'm honored to be occasionally chosen to put articles on this site. I was a ghostwriter for many years and still do some ghostwriting. I picked up ghostwriting shortly after I became a full time writer, and it helped sort of fill out the monthly budget where writing money like my own novels, my own short stories, and so forth comes sporadically, sometimes quarterly instead of monthly. Ghostwriting money tends to come a little faster. So early on in my full-time writing career, most of my income came from ghostwriting. I've fortunately shifted to where it's a smaller portion of my income, and largely the money that I make from ghostwriting I use toward medical costs and that sort of thing. So, being a kidney transplant patient, my monthly medicines are pretty expensive, and ghostwriting allows me to pay those medical expenses without like really tightening the budget too much that the rest of my writing income pays for. So, I did get some advantages from ghostwriting. It allowed me to get some connections. It allowed me to practice things from the craft that I think really benefited me moving forward and part of a writing career. So this specifically, I wrote it for the month of February because they were kind of looking for tie-ins to Valentine's and that kind of thing. So I figured talking about romance writing, especially as a ghostwriter, someone who doesn't consider himself a romance writer by trade, would be interesting. So we got some response from this one, so I'll share it now and just kind of discuss some of the details as we go that I may have left out. All right, I don't consider myself a romance writer by any stretch of the imagination, but I have written a lot of it. As a ghostwriter, I produced a lot of content, far more than under my own name. Recently, I was cataloging all the stories I'd ever written, everything from flash fiction up to novel length, and kind of compiling them on a Trello board. And in a future stream, once I have all those stories uploaded onto those cards, I'll show kind of how I put that together and maybe how it can help some other authors. But in that process, I saw that I've written a little over 400 stories, everything from short stories to novels, in my own name, and then probably twice that many more ghostwriting. So a good portion of the content I've created over the years ends up being ghostwritten content, but it helped pay the bills. The vast majority falls into two broad categories. This is talking about my ghostwriting content. I've written a ton of business slash autobiography slash self-help nonfiction. I've written even more tons of romance in all categories, from Christian themed to erotica. This probably says something about what is selling out there. It also probably says something about me as a person. Talking about the business and autobiography and self-help books, often when I'm writing those, I've written them for pastors of big churches. I've written them for business people. I've written them for self-help gurus. And very often, especially people that are public speakers by trade, they know their ideas very well. They can articulate their ideas very well. The one thing they have a lot of trouble with is translating that to the written page. So even though word choice and all of that is very good, they can explain themselves very well. Figuring out how to write that as a chapter in a book is a completely different thing, and often that's where I came in as sort of a freelancer ghostwriter. Now on the romance side, apparently that's just a big selling point. I talk a little bit more about that as we go forward here. All right, there are a number of publishers, both big and obscure, that pump out romance novels as fast as they can be written, edited, and formatted for book and ebook. In the industry, these are sometimes referred to as mill houses. Some of these romance mill houses own a list of invented author names. These imaginary authors are quite prolific because there are dozens and sometimes hundreds of ghostwriters producing stories to be published under their names. I was one of those ghosts. I'm not sure if this revelation about publishing is a shock to you or a confirmation of what you already suspected. To be fair, there are even more romance writers who produce every single novel themselves and have loyal followings, not just the biggest names with the biggest publishers, but self-published romance authors who sell enough books to do this full time. I've met many of them at conventions, and they are as talented, creative, and serious about their work as any other genre greats. Anyway, there are some secrets a non-romance writer learned ghostwriting romance. Romance is the indulgence of fantasy. Romance relies on fantasy no matter how grounded it may be in reality. I don't mean that as an insult to the genre or its readers. Every story, even the most gritty and realistic, is a form of escapism. Stories meant to tell us the truth about something still transport us somewhere we would not have wandered on our own. Romance, more than any other genre, more than other genres, seeks to elevate us above the ordinary life, ordinary experiences, ordinary emotions. Reading romance does not mean a person is dissatisfied with their own life any more than non-romance readers. We all read books to experience lives different from our own, to meet people whose paths we would not otherwise cross. We all want to take risks on adventures we would not have the opportunity to experience on a random Tuesday. To safely partake in the extraordinary, the intense, that which does not conform to the normal patterns of life. Romance provides this in many, many different styles. Heat levels and audience expectation. All genres have rules based on reader expectations. Fantasy, science fiction, the many subgenres of horror, the romance millhouses I wrote for had very specific formulas and outlines they wanted followed. They wanted something creative done with the stories, but the stories and characters had to hit the beats and meet the requirements provided. Writers don't want to believe they are conforming to rules or following a formula because formulaic is an insult. But these publishers know what readers want and intend to deliver every time. Story and audience are connected, and that connection creates definitions. An important defining characteristic that differentiates romance stories according to taste is heat level. These heat levels are described different ways and are called different things by various individuals and groups within the industry, but there is a general consensus between authors, publishers, and readers. Heat levels of romance are defined by the intensity and expression of love or lust between the characters within the focal relationships of the story. This includes how intimacy and sex are presented in the story, what is shown or concealed on the page, how it is described, how far it goes, and how close the reader is to the action. Sometimes this is broken down into a numeric score from 0 to 4 or 0 to 5. These levels sometimes define how much cussing and what specific swear words are allowed as well. When I ghost wrote romance, which is what I'm talking about in this article, the instructions from these publishers that took ghost-written romance and published it were very specific. They knew exactly what heat levels they wanted, and within each heat level, they knew what they wanted for the type of story, what each character was going to do, when love scenes were going to come in, how the story was to end, and all of that. And then what allowed me to continue writing those stories was I found a way to be creative within those boundaries. So even though I'm not a romance writer naturally, when I was ghostwriting them, I learned the formulas, I learned what they wanted and what worked, and then I found a way to try to do something new with it. And I think that's what allowed me to be successful with ghostwriting that particular genre. And they kept calling me back, and it allowed me to pay my bills while I was working to build up my own writing portfolio that does the majority of supporting my life now. Many heat scales begin with wholesome romance, but there is a level below that called Christian romance. In a Christian romance, there is nothing more intimate than hand-holding. This would receive a score of 0, containing no sex, on or off the page. Christian/biblical. When I say a score of 0, I mean like on the heat level, it would be a 0 as opposed to moving up to a 4 or 5 or even a 1. Christian and biblical values are maintained throughout. Even antagonists can't do anything truly profane or swear upon the page. The main characters do not sin in any overt ways, even during conflict. It almost always ends in a proper marriage, but even then, no implications that there is going to be sex. They are planning to have a family, of course, but no sex as far as we can tell from the last few pages of the book. Old West settings are common, and pen pal slash mail order bride stories are plentiful, but ironically no sex. The next level up would be called wholesome romance, and a lot of people start the heat scores there. Wholesome romance can be told in most any setting, including historic, modern, fantasy, and more. You're not as likely to see billionaire romances, bad boy stories, or MC romances, standing for motorcycle clubs or biker stories, at this level or the next level up, which is sweet romance. Nothing more than hugging or kissing is shown. This receives a 0 score on the numeric scale 2. There are no love scenes shown or suggested on or off the page. These first two levels are typically about soulmates finding each other, although this can be true in some of the higher heat levels too. Alright, the next level up in terms of heat in a romance story is called sweet romance. Sweet romance allows for a little more intimacy and even a little sexual tension. This definition has slid a bit in recent years. Used to be that love scenes occurred off the page. Now there can be a careful scene or two on the page within a sweet romance. These are described in euphemistic detail and not in any extended play-by-play. The focus is on the emotional intimacy between the focal characters. This would receive a 1 or a 2 on the numeric scale. Off-page sex mentioned or one closed-door sex scene typically. This is where cuss words might start to appear. Definitely not the F word, though. These rules are pretty strict when you come to ghostwriting these stories. But also, these words mean something to the readers. So if you describe it as a sweet romance, if you describe it as a wholesome romance or anything along those lines, romance readers know what that means, know what to expect, and they expect the story to deliver or withhold the type of things that they don't want to see in a story. All right, moving on to sensual romance. Sensual romance is where almost any trope of romance can begin to be explored. The chemistry and tension between the characters is essential, and there will be consummation of the relationship, which will be described on the page. There likely will not be as many love scenes as found in higher levels of heat. This would rate a 3 on the numeric scale, with at least one open-door sex scene. Sometimes this level is called middle romance, but some people define the term middle romance as a step between sweet and sensual, in which case allowing on-page petting but nothing more. So middle romance is sometimes a separate category. Alright, sexy romance is about the sex and the love, but there will be a lot of sex. It will be illicit and not usually about the commitment. The characters are playing out fantasies, and the sex is explicit on the page. More graphic terms are used and sex scenes are longer. This rates 3 or 4 on the numeric scale, with open-door sex scenes and often graphic detail. There is some debate about which levels should include the F word and how many occurrences. By this level, authors are pretty much on the unlimited plan when it comes to F-bombs. Alright, and then lastly, erotica. Erotic romance is all about the physical. The titles and focus of the stories themselves may center around a specific sexual act or sexual fantasy category. The sex is described in graphic detail, and the reader is right in the action. This is a 4 for sure or a 5 on scales that separate out erotica as something different from erotic romance. Keywords are used to inform readers what they're getting in terms of heat. Whatever the highest level scene is in the book, that dictates the book's overall heat level. If one scene is graphic in nature but the rest of the book is sweet, then that story is not going to please either audience. A romance only works if the author understands what it is and what the intended audience desires out of it. All right, building up, delivering, and disappointing. Authors don't typically write with the desire to meet expectations. There is something that feels false in that way of thinking for many creators. At the same time, authors don't typically want to create stories people hate, particularly when writing in a genre they love. Even the most niche writers want a niche audience that truly appreciates what they publish. Readers often want a story that defies their expectations, or at least they think they do. Being surprised is a good thing. A confusing plot or tone is not. The one expectations readers want met for sure is for the story to be good, quote unquote. The structure of romance stories is intricately designed around building up and delivering for the audience. At all heat levels, romance stories consistently end with happily ever after or happy for now. Happy for now allows for a little bit of ambiguity. But on the whole, romance readers want resolution and a sense of victory. Much of the success within the genre comes down to a focus on delivering what the audience desires. Romance fans tend to be voracious readers. I've seen readers at romance conventions walk away with hundreds of books. I've seen it at other conventions too, but the difference is you don't see as many romance readers talking about their to-be-read pile. They buy 100 books, then they read 100 books, and they come back for more. They are fiercely loyal to the tropes and authors they like. Romance readers will cross over to other genres as well. Paranormal romance readers will start exploring horror. Others will dabble with crime fiction. Regency romance and fantasy romance readers will read fantasy subgenres. I was invited to a few romance conventions where readers requested to have some horror authors on hand. I had one woman come up to my table, read the book description, and decide she wasn't sure if she was going to like my horror series. But she said she'd give the first 3 books a try, and she bought the first 3 books on the spot. If you deliver what the audience wants to readers like this, you have a career. I've even experimented with some success at targeting my horror books to romance readers through Amazon ads. All right, next section, all relationships can use the tools of romance. After ghostwriting romance, I was better at developing characters and creating relationships between characters in other genres. Characters love each other in horror stories, just like romance. If you do a good job of building that connection on the page, it means more when bad things start to happen to these characters. Romance is designed around building tension, creating intimacy, and guiding readers to imprint themselves upon characters and relationships. That is true of romantic connections within other genres, but also with any type of relationship. Talking about ghostwriting romance, I have used the toolbox I've gained by writing romance to create tension between enemies in a story. I've used it to describe non-sexual friendships. Readers respond to this without realizing it is romantic in nature because it works and it works well. The erotic has its place in other genres, but the skill that goes into describing intensity and intimacy in a sweet or wholesome romance is incredibly powerful when applied to non-romantic relationships. Readers care about these characters because the characters really care about each other. That is probably my greatest takeaway from ghostwriting romance, even though I don't consider myself a romance writer at all. I found that being able to write a friendship on the page using the sort of tools in romance that make characters care about each other made for some really powerful characters on the page, really powerful dialogue, and I found readers responding to my characters more strongly because I was using that toolbox to create some real intensity and real emotions around the characters. Next section of this article on ghostwriting romance as a non-romance writer, improving formulas and breaking rules. I think this is very important for any writer to understand, regardless of what genres they're working in. So in this section I say this is one of the dividing lines between stories that work and stories that don't. Great writers and struggling storytellers. How skillfully can you break the rules? The conventional wisdom on grammar and storycraft is that the best way to successfully break the rules is to fully understand the rules first. If you don't know the rules as a creator, you're not breaking them. You're just wandering around them accidentally. So when you know a rule, let's keep it simple, like grammar. Like if you know where commas go, if you understand those rules completely to where you know exactly where commas go and where they don't, then when you decide to break the rule to make a particular sentence stand out or make the story flow better, it's more purposeful because you understand how the rule's supposed to work, you understand why you're breaking it, and why breaking it in that instant works. So you're kind of giving yourself more power by understanding the rules of not only writing conventions like grammar, but storytelling, of plot, of character, and then being able to break those rules on purpose as you go forward. People who are not keen on romance as a genre often see these stories as being empty cookie cutter copies of each other with slightly reworked covers. They despise the formulas without fully understanding why the formulas work. It would sound odd if a writer spent all their time railing against every story that followed a three-act structure, or disparaging any tale that utilized a rising and falling action. Oh great, here comes another novel with the climax followed by denouement, so formulaic and expected. There is a risk in breaking rules. It's not always the wrong choice, but you as the author must deliver better on the broken rule than the formula can deliver with the rule observed. Great stories break rules. So if you want your story to achieve greatness, you're probably going to break some of the rules to make it stand out from other things in the genre. But anytime as a writer, whether it's a short story or a novel, if you choose to set aside a rule and move in a different direction, that direction you have to deliver it skillfully enough that it's better than if you'd followed the rule. If following the rule and following the formula or following the pattern of the genre would have created a better story, then you're breaking the rule wrong. You either need to write that better, or you need to find a way to stick within the rule and make that unique in another way. So the choice to break rules is a risky choice, but you have to deliver when you choose to do it. It requires real skill and wisdom. There is also great power in truly understanding and accepting the value of the formula while finding what hasn't been done with it yet. So you could write a vampire story and follow the exact traditional rules of vampires, but then within that structure, if you find a way to tell a story that nobody has ever seen with vampires, that's going to be an incredibly powerful book, because all the readers will recognize the rules. It's not like they're learning about a new monster that you've invented, that you're calling a vampire. They recognize these creatures. They understand how it works. It fits within the full tradition. But now you've made a story that really stands out. They're like, I recognize this, and every vampire lover will appreciate it, but it's also a unique story. So if you're able to do that, you could build an entire career around that. Next section, learning from what you don't like. Ghostwriting is not my favorite thing. I do it less often now, but for more money than I did in the past. The more I make from my own work, the more and more I say no to ghostwriting. The fact that I write so much romance as a ghost and almost none for myself probably indicates it is not a natural interest of mine. I'm a non-romance writer at my core. I've written it, many titles which have sold well under other people's names. I read it in connection with jobs and appreciate what it offers in terms of storycraft, but it is not really my thing, not really. One suggestion I found interesting as I started streaming on Twitch was to watch successful streamers you don't like to see what they do that works. The goal is not to copy someone you don't enjoy, but to separate yourself from the familiar things you respond to in order to be able to analyze what is working in another presentation. So again, like if I were watching a stream of something that I just really enjoy, sometimes it almost doesn't matter if the presentation is flawed, because the subject itself interests me. But if I'm really doing it from an analytical standpoint, and there's a streamer who's really, really successful, but they don't really do what I don't really like what they do, I can watch their stream and see why what they're doing is working. Now, for me, I can't really think of a whole lot of categories like that. I follow a lot of writing streamers, and then I follow streamers in other categories of creativity and that sort of thing, and I just enjoy watching people create. So this is a little tougher for me because there's not a lot of people out there that I look and I just hate what they do. But the point being that if there's someone you're like, I don't understand why people like this person, if you actually watch them and see how people are responding to them, you might learn something that'll help you. The goal is not to copy someone you don't enjoy, but to separate yourself from the familiar. Once those details are understood, they can be applied to what you do to improve your outcomes without compromising your voice or vision. Now, of course, I'm bringing this back into the idea of writing. Most of the craft advice available on Twitch is centered around video games. While I'm not streaming video games, I can still learn the principles being discussed and figure out how they do apply to what I do. There are authors who are more successful than us that we would like to dismiss if we could. Every author has somebody or some genre that's sort of a pet peeve of theirs. They don't understand why people like it. We call them hacks, and we accuse them of following a formula to trick people into buying and reading their books. If we take a beat to study them, we might learn something that could be useful to what we are doing. There are always missing elements to our own approaches, clues that might make a big difference as their difference are there to be discovered in the work of people achieving things we are not. The same is true within genre. If the mill houses want romance, then it must be because it sells. You can find mill houses repugnant. Again, speaking earlier in the article, mill houses are the people that hired folks like me to ghostwrite, and then they would put the stories under someone else's name, and they would just pump out these romance novels for people to read. Most romance is not done that way. They're very successful romance writers, but these mill houses produce a lot of romances under a few names and make a lot of money doing it. All right, so you can find those mill houses repugnant while still understanding that readers are responding for a reason. You can dislike the genre while still understanding there is something there, and it might be something you can use if you take the time to understand it. All right. Talk to successful romance authors and read some books. If you can't stomach a romance book, find some books on the craft of writing them and glean what you can from those discussions. The more tools you have at your disposal, the better equipped you are to break down the rules and formulas to then successfully build your own way. If you really want to do something new with horror, crime fiction, or thrillers, figure out the tools of poetry, romance, and fantasy. If you want to boost tension or conflict in another genre, figure out how good horror achieves that. Break readers' expectations and surprise them by using the tools from other places that work well without letting on how you did it.